Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Forest Creek podcast. Thank you for tuning in for part 2 of our enlightening discussion with Father Antony-Paul, Coptic Orthodox Priest. If you haven't already, I'd highly recommend listening to part 1 of our discussion. It might help things to make a little bit more chronological sense. Or you can listen to everything backwards. It's kind of fun, like time traveling. If you want to time travel even further back and listening to some of our older shows, you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and probably a bunch of other places soon. All of them at the Forest Creek. But for now, without further ado, part 2 of our discussion with Father Antony-Paul. So, there is this kind of ancient idea that pervades the modern world, and we touched on this a little bit before. It's the idea that we create our own gods rather than vice versa. And some people kind of tend to tie it to nihilism, you know, the belief that there is no meaning, God is dead, all that stuff. Yeah. Or the idea that in a world that's lacking divine ordination, if there is no objective truth, if you accept that to some extent, you have to kind of make your own meaning. And Nietzsche, the guy who invented nihilism, kind of does that through the Übermensch philosophy of you become God, you figure it out, you start to order your own world. It's still a little bit kind of true in a kind of more hippie way, where it's like, we're just on a journey, man, we're going to figure out our own meaning. In that way.
Captain of my own ship.
Does it fall to us to create our own meaning in that sense? Or does religion necessitate that there's a pre-existing meaning to be sought out then?
I think it does. And that's what would differ from religion to religion, right? It would either tell you that you have meaning or it could possibly tell you that your meaning is non-meaningful, right? So for example, if you look at the Babylonian religion of the time of the exile of the Jews, their mythology has the gods got in a fight, they killed their mom, and like their dad was angry because like they were being loud while he was trying to sleep, right? And that then, long story short, at some point they used the blood to create humans, and the meaning of humans is to serve the gods, right? So then anybody who's subscribing to that religion theoretically can only find meaning, like objective meaning, in the context of being on the whim of the gods, with whatever that entails, even if it is a subjectively negative experience. The non-religion is doing the exact same thing. They're creating they're making up stuff and telling people, suggesting to people what it should be. And that's when, like, it depends on the claim of the religion. So to a Christian, I would emphatically like, yes, to us, we are saying here is your objective meaning, right? It's not something to discover. Actually, to us, it's not even something to become. It's saying that everybody already has that meaning, is one of our claims. You can embrace it or spurn it, but that your meaning is always found in your sonship or daughtership to God. Whereas like that's your identity, and that the goal of creation is X. And so it's just a matter of, am I living according to that meaning or not? That's where I have an option. But we're claiming you don't have an option about being who you are. You're already that. Whether you profess the faith, did the whole I believe thing, whether you're baptized, we're like, oh, you're still dad's kid, right? To us, it becomes a question of like, are you intentionally living in that relationship, both with dad and the family, or not, right? Another religion might have a different claim and what makes a person have meaning. So I'm like, that's where I think we all differ from one another of like, what is our claim about those things?
The claim, again, we get back to the idea of there is the objective truth that acts like as a flagpole to some extent, and you can work your way from there. You need the point of, you know, you can't just be a single boat in the ocean with no idea where to navigate. That's why we use the stars. We need a second point to kind of figure out our direction in that way. And so if you plant it with objective truth, the idea of God, then at least you have that second point to navigate from. I'll move on to the next question shortly, but I just got a bunch of messages from my Catholic friend begging to join us.
Oh, cool.
So he's on his way over. I'm going to make him sit quietly. So the next question I got here on the topic of nihilism, kind of continuing on. If nihilism, to some extent, if you don't, because a lot of people just like the first half. They don't like the you become your own God. They don't like the you find your own meaning part. They're just like, oh, God is dead, so I have the free pass now.
Yeah.
And what that kind of seems to leave you with, though, is that you've got nothing left here but entropic decay. You know, it's just the forces of entropy that are slowly bringing everybody to death, and you're circling the drain. May as well hedonistically kind of suck up as much of it as possible. That's very true of a lot of the attitudes of like younger generations, especially, that a lot of people start viewing their brains as dopamine machines, and we're just kind of playing it like a controller. Has it been spiritually effective to use religion as the antidote to this? You know, I'm sure a lot of people are kind of stuck on this problem of like, how do we reinstill values when we got rid of them?
And that's where I'm like, you can't divorce the spirit from the theology that governs it, because it's like, I mean, we're making claims about it, and saying that something is wrong, we mean it objectively, right? We don't just mean it in terms of preferred, right? So I think that the struggle is communicating that, and that's where everything we talked about kind of comes in, like these flag points, these cultural issues. Like those flag points are what makes a person Orthodox versus Catholic, right? Like that word in the whole thing, right? Like the biggest signpost being like, what do you think of Jesus? And then after that being like, what about these other things that are governing what we're claiming to be fact? Basically, they're the dogma part, which is like comparable to law in science, right? That within science you have your law and you have your theory. Theory needs to conform to law, right? And you can have varying levels of theory, right? But these signposts for us are the dogma, and that's where the Orthodox part comes in. And I think that in the effort to try and simplify and be cool or approachable, and I'm not anti either of those, but just not at the expense of truth, we have underplayed the truth part of saying this is why it matters, right? Because to us it's saying, like, don't put your finger in the socket, you'll get electrocuted if it actually goes in. It's not our preference about whether you get electrocuted by putting it in, it's that we believe that you really will, that actually will happen, right? And I think that that's what gets lost in discussions of faith, because there's an assumption that it's not grounded in real objective reality, that it's always blind and like ethereal in nature, where it's like, no, we believe that there are real things. And I think that's what's being lost. So that I'm like, I don't know that it's the damage has been from how, the question is not, has religion done well to fix that? In the sense of, if religion was done rightly, I think it would. I think because religion hasn't been done rightly or taught rightly is, I think, what created so many of those issues that we're now trying to fix. I'm like, if we did it right, we probably wouldn't have got there. And so it's like the way we talked, what we did, not making that distinction between what's objectively right and wrong, trying to force a culture on other people. Like, all of those are historically why everybody is rebelling, is those very things.
It's interesting what you said at the beginning of that, was that, you know, you can't divorce the theology from the spirituality. And it's almost like that's what we're trying to do to some extent. It's like, you know what you need is some yoga, and some SSRIs. That's the right.
Which is, sorry, I'm on a tangent now, because I'm just like, a person practicing yoga independently of Buddhism, which is a subsect of Hinduism, exactly. Like, I'm like, if you want to follow the path, is like somebody going into a Coptic Orthodox church or any Orthodox church and being like, yo, that censer he's swinging with the smoke, that's cool. That makes me feel good. Yeah. I'm going to go buy one and do it around my house. And I'm like, oh, you physically can, right? Yeah. But you've divorced it from what it is and what it does and what its meaning is. You took it out of its context, you gave it a new one, and you made it serve this new God, which is you. Right? And it's just like, that's what I mean. Like, I love that you use that as an example of being like, but no, like, I wonder, I don't know enough, like, I vaguely studied in world religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, but I wonder what, like, the early fathers, quote unquote, of those religions would think of how yoga is being used today. Like, if they're cringing and they're like, no, that's not what it is.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned something earlier about, you know, some of the monks, they didn't want to preach to, like, take in any Westerners, for instance. And I've actually heard the same thing in a number of religious or spiritual traditions, or even cultural ones, right? You have the Japanese Zen monks early on took the same exact approach. It's like, if you're not Japanese, we don't want to teach you. Certain even martial arts styles in China, they don't want to teach you their kung fu if you're not Chinese. We hear the same thing from practitioners of yoga. It's like, you're not Indian.
Yeah.
You're not from even this part of India. We don't want to teach you
Yeah.
in that way. So there is, again, the barrier of entry with these things. Ethnicity and culture can really become that, even though you always think about theology and spirituality. They're things in the mind. They don't pertain to our physical being. So how can it be stuck to the color of my skin?
Yeah.
Or the language I'm speaking, for
Right.
instance. Even though, I guess in the sense of language, it can become a tool for understanding that. Anyway, not to go too far down the rabbit hole. So we were on the topic of nihilism. On the flip side of nihilism, it has a more optimistic cousin, absurdism, popularized by Albert Camus, with a line that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Sisyphus being that Greek character who's in Hades, sentenced there by Zeus, and he has to roll up that rock every time. To the nihilist, entropic decay, Sisyphus just keeps rolling that thing up, and it's as pointless as life because it's has no meaning. The rock goes right back down the hill. But Camus kind of turns it around and says, what if he's happy? If he's happy, isn't the happiness its own meaning? So it kind of pokes at this look towards the natural state of entropy instead as good. And it made me wonder, is Christianity designed to combat entropy or to accept it?
Neither. I think, because even that is like, it's a good example of what we were talking about earlier, being like, who decided that happiness was good?
Right.
Right? Like that's random, right? Or like, who cares if Sisyphus is happy? Right? Like, how did we know that the meaning was in the walking up? Right? The person who told him, like Zeus, was he right to say it or not right to say it? Like, it's literally trying to take one scene out of context and use it to frame the whole narrative. Right? So that's why I'm just saying I don't think the Christianity is dealing with either directly, in the sense of we're not trying to answer that question. Right? We're trying to answer the question that we believe to be objectively true, not just philosophically true.
Right.
I was saying, like, that very first question about Coptic Orthodox Christian, it's the Christian part. I was saying, if Jesus is who he says he is, what's the narrative? Right? What does that mean? Right? And then the Orthodox part, the Catholic part, comes in to be like some of these signposts along the way of like, okay, so how do I interpret this? How do I react to this? Like, what's true about this journey? How do I evaluate it? Where, to be honest, like, the Orthodox Catholic were on the same page of virtually everything in terms of living, right? So it would be about the whys and having some objective meaning, and that emotions bow to the meaning, right? In terms of the Sisyphus being happy part, or being like, it's going to sound horrible, we don't care how you feel. Like, in the sense of, like, has nothing to do with whether it's good to do or not.
Yeah.
And then to the nihilist being like, it's just objectively stupid to do certain things and objectively good to do certain things. And that our assessment of those is rooted in this claim about Jesus being God.
Right. Without, again, the objective truth flagpole.
Yeah.
Your being happy doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing to think about. I guess if there is anything useful about absurdism, is that it kind of gives a nihilist the excuse to be optimistic. And that can sometimes kind of lead to you getting out of the rut of being a nihilism, of thinking there is no meaning.
Right.
In some sense.
But then are you really out of the rut, or do you just feel like it?
Interesting. What? I guess your mood is improved. That's all we can really say.
I'm happily in the same state. Yeah.
This one I've been kind of quite curious about. What is original sin? How do we define it? And is this the story of the Garden of Eden that has to tell it? What is the apple in that story?
I can answer that.
AD, where did you come from? You're not the one I booked for this podcast. Shh.
I hopped in, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, original sin, that's more of a Catholic term, right? I don't think the Orthodox use original sin. They use like ancestral sin or something different. I was very close to becoming Orthodox, so I did a ton of research into the, into the East, and there's a lot that I love. But yeah, if I'm not mistaken, I think original sin was more of the Western fathers, kind of like, particularly with St. Augustine. But the East, I don't think they have the exact same understanding. It's similar, but if I'm not mistaken, it's not the same.
Yeah. I mean, they're pretty compatible now. Because I think we used to really hyper-emphasize that difference, because I think there was a phase in Catholic life where a particular reading of it was emphatically done. But I think the Catholic Catechism today is so open to it being used both ways. Actually, I really like that it's now not forcing a certain way. But I think where we'd agree on is this idea that the fall had an effect beyond just the individual who falls, right? Of saying, so even St. Augustine, when I finally read on original sin, wasn't saying what I thought he was saying by pop culture standard, right? Where he's just saying you can't divorce incarnation of Christ. You can't divorce the sacraments from that something really happened in that event, right?
Yeah.
And like we'd all agree, right? Where we might disagree is on like, okay, am I guilty of what he did? That's where there was some philosophical debate. The Orthodox emphasis more on you don't inherit the guilt, you inherit the consequence. And that's like, and today East is meeting West, I think, very easily.
The Catechism explicitly says that, right? That you don't inherit the guilt of Adam, but the effects, the consequence of the sin you do, right?
Exactly.
And so, like death entered into the world, and
Exactly.
all this dysfunction, and the Old Testament kind of one just gets worse and worse and worse.
100%.
So to get back to that part of the question, though, what is the apple?
And that is where, depends on what tradition you're in, where that's become contentious, very much contentious in our tradition. This is why I'm jealous of the Catholics, because they went through this like 60 years ago. So like they get to move on, whereas we're having the debates today about allegory versus literalism versus all of that. I think what we'll all agree on, so I don't get myself in trouble by anyone who listens to this, is that something really happened. Right? That there was a design of creation, and creation strayed from design. And the cause of the straying from the design is a corruption and decay materially and spiritually of creation that needed a fixing. Right? I'd almost say that the details of some of those are like what we were talking about earlier, of like there's law, right? And then there's theory. And within theory you can have well established and less established, and as long as they don't break laws, we're fine. And so I think there's a lot of debate that's in the realm of theory, but being presented as a debate in the realm of law. I think we'd all agree that there's a law that something happened. There's a real creation, intentional creation, regardless of the mechanism of it. Was it a literal boom, there's a human, or was it evolution, right? There's room for debate in those. Is the fall, some of the early fathers debated, was the fall an event of one person or was it not? But they'll come back to that you're designed, you're supposed to be something. When you didn't, you broke it. And the consequence of breaking was beyond the breaker, right? And that it needed fixing and all the consequences.
It can be hard to view that in a context sometimes, because you almost look at it like, well, that event, that original sin, was the impetus for me existing. It was what gave me the freedoms to think and feel and, arrive at the same conclusions that I do now. How can it have been bad if it enriched my life in some way? Like some people see it as the apple is free will in some sense.
Oh, I see what you're asking. I think I understood the question.
If I can kind of relate this a little bit, there's, again, I love Greek myth. There is the story of Promethean fire, where Prometheus steals fire and gives it to the humans, even though the humans were like homunculi that Zeus made as playthings. He's like, well, don't break my design. And then the idea that the fire was stolen was kind of like it added that original sin to it, in that he broke the design to, give humans that free will kind of look, or whatever it was that kind of inspired it.
Which is, I don't think what we're saying doctrinally. So the tree was an evil and the knowledge was an evil. When we use it as a symbol of free will, it wasn't to signify free will being wrong. It was about a wrong use of free will, right? So if you read some of like the early church fathers, many will write things like, oh, there's going to be a time where Adam ate from that on purpose, like sanctioned, right? Like we're not allowed to drive till we're 16. I don't know if that's the same thing in BC, but where it's like, it's not because driving is evil, right? Like I could drive, and some people might even be capable of driving at 8. That could be weird, but maybe.
Right.
But I'm just saying that it's not about the driving per se, and that there'd be a right time to do it. So we're not saying, and that moron Adam, his mistake is wanting to have choice. It's like, well, he was given choice. Like the choice was intentional. Like giving him the freedom to choose was intentional.
Yeah.
As opposed to what I do with my choice, which is the universal problem today, right? Like, what do I do with my choice, and recognizing that my choice isn't just personal. I think that's where original sin really comes in, right? It was saying like a personal decision is never really just personal, right? There is always an impact on a sphere greater than just myself.
It's really interesting to think about too, because I don't know, when we reflect, you know, as you say yourself, it was the fall in some way. So before that was the alma mater, the golden age, the Edenic period. And when you think about it in that sense, like if everything was working according to design, it almost seemed like the intention was for everything to just be animals and plants in some way. And that in following the order that God had preordained was to just be in nature. You know, and the way that the way the cat comes in this room and the way he acts was exactly according to God's design. But me thinking and deciding things and eventually, I guess in that way, sinning is not.
Right. And sin for us is straying from how you're designed, right? As opposed to breaking a rule, right? So like imagine if you're selfish and you're like, imagine if like dad comes home and there's like dinner on the table and there's 4 members of the family and there's 1.5 pieces of chicken. If I lunge for one piece to be like, I need to make sure that I eat, right? I made a personal decision based on whatever I did it on, of I want, I need, whatever my reasoning is, I decided I'm taking, right? There's going to be effects. It might be the next day, it's just like, I better lunge faster because of whoever else now is going to be reacting to me. Right. It might be I'm going to punch someone in the face. You know what I mean? But I'm saying is like suddenly like we got different because of people's decisions.
Kind of Aristotelian as well, right? Because Aristotle talked about like when you define something as good, it's according to the end, the final end of the thing, right? And so you can't really determine the good of a thing if you don't understand the end or the purpose of it, right? Because that's you have to compare it to something, right? So for example, he talks about a knife. A knife is to cut. That's the purpose of a knife. A bad knife is a knife that doesn't cut well. Right. And so the challenge is like, well, what is the purpose of the human being? Yeah. If we can't establish some standard of like what like a definite end for the human being, then it becomes difficult to know whether it's like, is he going to is he good or is he bad? Right.
And to even use that as an analogy, I think that's a good analogy. Is like if it was a bad knife, is that there's consequences that affect more than others, right? If I suddenly can't cut this fruit into pieces or this meat, I'm forcing people to bite into gigantic pieces, which might have its own effect, right? It might numb my teeth. It might make me glutton. Like I'm just saying is that bad knife caused something more than just. It's like the butterfly effect, but on a human nature level.
When we get back to sinning, it's like you're not putting premium gas in the car. Yeah. This car needs premium gas. If you don't put premium gas, it's not going to run well. And then straying from the design can cause a number of other things to fall apart. I guess I had it in here because I've heard it a few times, especially from younger people asking in like Q&As and everything. They're like, why do we have free will if it causes us to stray from design? Wouldn't everything just be better if we didn't have free will? So it kind of made me wonder, is free will good or evil in itself? But I guess we kind of answered that a little bit.
I mean, in the Christian tradition, when we say you're created in the image and likeness of God, it means sharing his characteristics. And one of those characteristics is autonomy. So it's, to us, intrinsically good to have will. And it's also the only thing in my possession that allows me to love. Right? Because it's the only thing that allows me to show favor to something. Right? Otherwise, you're reduced to being a robot. So that's what I'm like, is to say, get rid of it, just saying, okay, don't let me love. And that's when like, it's this weird thing in modern society. I'm like, on the one hand, you're saying that, but you hate being controlled. But you're also saying, I would like to be controlled. Whereas just like, which one do you want? Like, do you want to choose or do you want to be predetermined even in your individual behavior?
It's almost like we're missing that definition. That part of the definition of when we say something like love is that it's necessary for you to choose to love in order for that to actually be love in that way. Yeah. It's an interesting way to think about it. So moving on a little bit, when we get to it, what in layman's terms is God? Why is the term so fluid Is God the universe itself? Is God the force of physics in it? Is he the embodiment of objective truth? I think we kind of brushed on this earlier. And is it even possible to define God in the first place?
And that's where it depends on which religion you belong to is what claim you're doing, right? Like the Christian claim is God is a person, God is a who, not a what, right? So God in the Christian tradition is Trinity. Like that's who he is. Like that's his state of existence, right? And then God is author of creation. So God can be
That would be the Father
approached
and,
through
wouldn't it?
the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right?
Yeah.
But it's saying that all three participate in the creation, right?
Okay.
But you can see a designer through design. So we wouldn't object to saying I can see God through nature. I wouldn't say that nature is God. I guess it's the, if we're going to get philosophical, the difference or formal, I mean, the difference between pantheism and panentheism, right? God in everything a Christian's fine with. God is everything we're not okay with. But there are religions that would claim that. So it depends on now what religion and what claim that they're making.
I guess like the Hindu have the Atman and Brahman,
Yeah.
for instance. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jumping back into it, does the church compete with social media influencers? Many people, especially secular folk, seem to find people like Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate, for instance, especially with young men, to be almost more palatable than, you know, white squares or wizard beards in some ways. So we're almost, I don't know if it's an accessibility thing or because it's almost removed from the institutional context, that it's almost a little easier to hear the values. And we kind of talked about this a little bit with the idea of being spiritual but not religious, or, you know, practicing yoga but not actually learning it from a guru, for instance. So does the church have to find itself competing with people who do that in some sense, who are able to take the value and then run away and put it on Instagram or whatever?
I think once the church starts competing, she's lost.
Interesting.
Right? Like it's supposed to be what we believe. That's something that the job of the church is theoretically to proclaim the truth. That's it. Right? Is that we call ourselves the people of God, right? And that we are participating in that life. I think that it's gonna happen that there's gonna be people competing, right? Like socially, because the body's made up of real people who have real influences. I think people like Jordan Peterson and Shapiro, for example, who I haven't watched or listened enough of either. I see the lure. I think that part of it might be like, oh wow, that person like said what like people aren't willing to say or scared to say, or there's that wow shock factor. And I think that in the ethnic Orthodox culture, because there's not, to most people, enough culturally relevant people, I think there's an even bigger lure, because you see phenomenon like in the Roman Catholic Church of people like Bishop Barron, who have that same charisma that the religious congregate around. Whereas I highly doubt, I don't get any vibe that Bishop Barron's competing. He's just actually doing his job, right? And that has been attractive. So there are people who will use him to compete, but I don't think that's what he's doing. You know what I mean? That's like the people are going to react the way that they react, right? But the church has to be church, right? And then someone like Jordan Peterson needs to find out, what is Jordan Peterson, right? Like in his mind, is that, am I a proclaimer of truth? What am I? Am I just doing my profession and it took on this look?
Right.
You know what I mean?
I guess a lot of people tend to look at it like it's Donald Trump's 4D chessboard and he's moving the church, he's moving the bishop across, you know, trying to win something here in the culture war, even though that's not the game the church is playing at all.
Right.
Well, like there definitely are churches that have started engaging in kind of like a competitive nature. And you can start seeing that in like the way that they evangelize is almost like a salesman.
Yeah.
And it's crazy now because we know, like through psychology and all these experiments, we know like the particular ways in which we can manipulate people, you know, propaganda and things like that. And so you basically literally get Christian propaganda. That's a real thing.
They've made 4 God is Not Dead movies. That is my favorite example.
I like the second one.
To compete.
The Newsboys.
And I'm like, that guy was Tarzan growing up. The main actor, he used to be Tarzan. I forgot his name. Kevin Sorbo.
So on the
Hercules, sorry.
On the topic of influencers, the Protestant church in particular seems to view charisma as often divinely inspired. Others tend to see charismatic persuasion as dangerous or opposed to logical and intellectual persuasion. And, we talked a little bit about the idea of, the subjective and the objective kind of being two sides of one coin. Mm-hmm. There seems to be a balance in that sense between thinking and feeling. Is one more important than the other? And how does the balance have to lie? And maybe we did touch on this earlier before, but...
I mean, you're not a human without feeling, or at least if you have zero feeling, most would consider you disordered, right? But I think this is what Christ means when he talks about spirit and truth, right? Is that the two matter, right? So I can't be all touchy-feely with no objective truth, right? So I don't have a problem that somebody might be emotionally affected by something, right? That's not intrinsically wrong. It's if my goal is to just emotionally manipulate or it's to divorce it from the truth, right? That's why I was just with Sis, who cares how he feels, right? That's secondary. If he happens to like it, cool. But it's not the primary, right? But the word charism itself means gift, right? So within a Christian context, it's a charism is a gift, which means it's not intrinsically mine. It's something that I received. So if I received, then the credit should be going to the giver, not to the one who's handing it out, right? And if a person that has a charism is functioning that way, it'll function very healthily because the person won't be self-obsessed or self-absorbed, right? And the goal won't be, how do I make people feel X, right? It'll be, what are we saying, right? And then we can navigate how we feel, right? And so it's putting it in the right order. But I think this aim to make people cry, I don't understand it. I think it's
there's also
weird.
The dangerous end of it that people worry about sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I worry about it when I see the crowds of people were crying and throwing themselves on the floor like they're trying to warn Kim Jong-un or something, and they're having seizures or whatever, and look at them, is that entirely good?
Right.
Is this from a divine source or is it from something more sinister?
Mm-hmm.
I think I'd be curious to hear your thought on this, because I a lot of that, a lot of these the charismatic movement kind of started more in the Protestant traditions, right? And my theory is that it's in large part because they don't have the sacraments, and I think there's a desire for them, and that's basically what the charismatic movement was, right? It's kind of trying to fulfill that desire for something real, something immediate, something tangible.
Yeah.
And the closest they can get is an experience or a feeling or a miracle or something
right.
like that.
Which the Catholics and the Orthodox would call sacramental, right? They're saying that you're looking for a mystery, you're looking for a physical sign of a spiritual reality, right? In doing that. So I think there's something to your point, to be honest. And I think when there is this intentional, and that's we can't divorce any of the conversations from history, right? Is that everyone's always reacting to something, right? The Protestants are reacting to a particular way that they felt at the time about certain things. They evolved, right? So then they inherit stances, right? Same thing with all the other traditions. So it's when you divorced some of these things from where they come from, you end up with these expressions that are what is this? And to the point again of that whole free will thing, of just saying someone's free will had a really long-term effect, right? On all of these things.
So I've just discovered that I'm now on to the slew of fun questions, or at least for me. Asking if you've ever seen a ghost or an angel or a demon or any kind of spiritual apparition, it almost feels like I'm asking if you've seen a UFO in some way. Have you ever had an encounter with any of these things, UFOs included? Is this what we tend to call beatific visions? How do we know if an apparition is trustworthy? Even if it seems to tell you or reveal something that's good. Some people talk about psychedelic hallucinations and they learn something from it, but we always say that a hallucination isn't necessarily a good thing. Mm-hmm. If you're a schizophrenic paranoid, all your hallucinations are bad by inference. But for some reason, when you hallucinate seeing a saint, it's a completely different thing.
Right. So in monastic tradition, you don't talk about your own very much, but so I'll avoid that part of it, but I'll still talk about something like it. But I have not seen UFOs. Have I seen stuff? Yeah, I won't get into the details of that in terms of on a personal. And that's why I'm just saying it has to on some level be rooted in objective truth, that there is an answer to the question of, did that person see that? right? Like to us, it's not just like this subjective made up thing when it comes to something like an apparition or a miracle, right? Even if we can arrive at the answer, we believe that there is an answer. So the church will usually have hesitation about public proclamations of those events, because if it was mistaken or if there was something else, no one wants to be responsible for that, while we're also acknowledging that those things really do happen. So it's not that we're divorcing from, yeah, there could be miracles, but it's like, do you proclaim that, right? Or do you allow the individual to have the experience? So for example, like we talked about the whole like atheistic phase, I was thrown off, for example, like my first retreat at that monastery, some random monk in a wheelchair that I've never met in my life, in the middle of crowds, right? Everybody's going up, taking his blessing and walking away. So I just copied them and walked away. And he yelled out after me, my name, which he didn't know. It was like my first or second, I was only there for 3 days. So like I didn't know anyone. And my former name before ordination is like yelling mom at a mall.
Wow.
But like call me by name and use an Arabic expression that's not just like it was a welcoming expression, but it's not the welcome you use like when somebody just comes home from work, right? It's a specific expression that you use when somebody's come from afar or after a journey. And so I turned around because I'm like, maybe it doesn't mean me. Like again, the name is common. And then he points right at me and repeats it to be like, yeah, it's you, right? Or for example, there's experiences of people who, because at one point I thought demonic possession is just some schizophrenic episode or some psychotic break, right? But when you get like a 5-year-old from a village in Egypt where he hasn't learned how to read and write Arabic because he doesn't go to school, coming to a monastery and speaking in fluent English like he's been going to college, and then post-exorcism doesn't have that knowledge, and he didn't even have an exposure to that language in those days. It's like that's now in the realm of the objective, like, occurrence, right? You can have a debate on the meaning, sure, right? But like that it occurred is a whole other thing. So I've had experiences of seeing people know things that couldn't possibly know, and I mean in specific details, right? Like I've had an elder monk who's never left the country of Egypt name the city of Thunder Bay and events that occurred with somebody there that he couldn't possibly have known. I was the person, right? So it was like, I was like, yeah, remember when you, and insert like these different activities that I did and things that I saw, and I never ever spoke to him about it, to the point that everybody like sitting around him assumed we had like some conversation about it before. So I have seen those things that I won't lie, because I used to be like, oh, we don't need miracles to believe, but I'm like, well, I mean, they're helpful. Like they're not wrong. Yeah, exactly. Like it's why not? We believe in the supernatural world.
Yeah.
Why are we surprised at a supernatural occurrence?
Yeah, like I feel like I went through a very similar process where I was basically I was happy with like the sacraments. I was happy with the things that were more in the tangible kind of, because I was still a materialist, to be honest. I was still so steeped in materialism my whole life, so it was hard to start breaking out of that. But I feel like you can't relate to scripture the same way. Like it's there. There's so many times where like miracle, and like you can't escape it. It's so in your face right through the New Testament. You see it, crazy miracles happening in the Old Testament. It's like, okay, so is this just simply symbolic? Or it's like, well, we believe that God is capable of all things, right? So it's always going to have to be in the realm of possibility. But obviously you have to be careful, because you have to test the spirits and make sure, well, number one, if it is in fact supernatural, and then if it is supernatural, was it a good angel or was it a bad angel? Because we know that the demons can perform their own miracles as well. And we actually you see that like even in like Exodus, right? They had the magicians, doing their own tricks.
Yeah.
It's interesting because some people, they miss the definition of monotheism. They think it means there is only one God. And yeah, there's only one capital G God in the belief, but it doesn't mean there is only one major spiritual being. A bunch of smaller G gods, the Egyptian magicians, or even the existence of angels, or the existence of devils or demons. It doesn't mean that there is only one, spiritual being, clearly. It's that we only worship one.
Yeah. And not just worship God, again, it comes to the whole noun thing of that the word itself did have different meanings. Right, so like even the Old Testament says like give thanks to the God of gods, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't an acknowledgement that the pagan gods were real gods, right? But in the spiritual hierarchy, it's like there's, like you were referencing Aristotle before, like there's a whole philosophy on even bodies of celestial beings, right, in the ancient world. So like there's anything that was not human could have been put in that realm, but things meant things. So like to your point of being like a hesitant yes, and this, like from a Christian tradition of being like yeah, but it wouldn't have been like, oh, we recognize Zeus as a real god, right? But it would be like you said, the angels, the realm of the realm of the celestial, essentially.
Interesting. So, a bit of a pivot on the topic of aliens and UFOs. In a sense, does it make sense for a Martian to become Christian if they exist? If they're intelligent and people-like enough, and these aliens happen to exist, are they also in God's image? Can they become Christian? Does it make any sense for them to do that? Because the Bible, as we know it, seems more or less very centered on Earth. But we are, the more we look outwards into space, like, wow, there's a lot of it out there. There might even be living things out there. I think we found evidence of water on Mars not too long ago. So how do we kind of wrap our heads around space?
So, I mean, the Bible is a history of God's interaction with humans on the earth, right? So, of course, it's like human-centered and earth-centric. So to me, if there were to be life that we meet in intelligent life in these other places, it would be a question of what's your story with God, who we know to be the Trinity, right? So if they had a different narrative, that would beg a new comparative religion thing, right? Of being like, wait, does this contest what we thought we knew about God? Yes or no? And then secondarily, because for example, baptism has a specific meaning in the incarnation as a result of the fall. So they're not random events, you know what I mean? Like they're all linked to each other. So that narrative is completely different if somebody had never had a fall, for example, right? That's why even in the realm of what we do know, angels don't get baptized, right? Because baptism means something to a human who has inherited that, right? That's what I mean about that whole theology can't be separated from the practice,
Right?
Because it'd be like, no, what's your theology? What do you know? What's your interaction? What did you see?
Right. It's interesting to think about because it's like, well, the Christ part of Christianity, unless Jesus was like Mormon Jesus and he was a space traveler in his spare time, they can't possibly have that same Christ figure in that way. So it's not like they could ever become Christians, but in the same way that we consider Judaism to be rooted in the same God, the aliens might do that. Are they, when they come down, are they going to be like another denomination? Or is it another religion altogether? Do they open their book and go, "See Zarquan 3:14" or something? I don't know. So I guess, yeah, okay. That kind of puts things into a little bit more perspective. I guess one of the things I'm curious about with this is, what is the nature of Christianity's coexistence with other religions? Because, we consider that denominations, we don't rule out that they will go to heaven or hell. And obviously we talked a little bit about how Coptic Orthodox Christianity is very ethnically rooted. So it would be strange for us to stop and draw the line at some place. We have a certain number of precepts that you need to accept in order that way. But at least from my view, from what I've studied, there's precepts in Zen and in Buddhism and in a number of other religions, even some pagan beliefs that don't actually conflict. So is there a way for multiple religions to coexist and everybody go to heaven, or like, is it impossible? Because we do have come back to that objective truth idea as well. Exactly.
I think that's where like people get uncomfortable today. Where I'm just like, I mean, we are on some level calling each other wrong.
Yeah.
Like it's uncomfortable, but we are, right? We are all. An atheist thinks I'm wrong, right? A Christian thinks that a Hindu is wrong. So like I'm gonna not skirt that. Like in the sense of it's not just about precepts, it's also about context. So I think a person can benefit if things are true from different precepts. In the same way that I could benefit from eating healthily even if I was eating healthily by accident. Right? If I just happen to have a proper diet, I can still get health benefits. It's different from saying that, of knowing why I'm right in that thing, right? Or that somebody saying, no, this is healthy because like my tree told me. Where it's like, wait, but there's a claim here now. Yeah. Right? Like what is the source of what made it true? And so that in that regard, I'm like, Scripture is clear that you specifically are supposed to believe in Christ, right? I'm not hesitating because I don't like that Scripture says that, but it's saying that I have a duty to that because I know and believe it to be true. What God wants to do about everything else, and it's not even, I'm not even trying to avoid or dance on the question, like, I actually have no idea, right? Of being like, what about the person who had no access to truth? What about the person who was so offended by scandal in their parish, right? Or like that their neighbor was a mass serial killer who acted religious, right? Like all those things that are understandable why a person rejected faith, if you will, of saying it's something like, oh, well, it shouldn't matter because the actual belief is this. I do think that, but that's not where most humans are at, where it's just like, I don't know how I could call that true, right? Like if that's what it produces, that hence like even in my own journey that I was talking about earlier, saying, wait, you're actually acting the way that you said we're supposed to. That's why it was compelling, right? So it was like, that's something like I'm not going to be like, oh yeah, like, because it was not based on the precepts, where I'm like, could there be what I'll call exceptions based on Scripture, right? Of saying that Scripture says you need to be this, right? Unless you're baptized and born again of water and spirit, then you don't have a place in the kingdom of God, right? I'm not shying from that. We are saying that. Actually, that Christ is saying that we're repeating it, right? And that he says, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you don't have life, right? But I also know that God can do whatever he needs to do about that. In the same way, for example, even scripturally, the right-hand thief technically, literally, physically didn't do either. But Christ said, you'll be with me today, right? So that's what I mean, is like that act of grace of God, I guess is trying to get at, is never governed by humans, right? Like the realm of grace is governed by him. So on a systematic level, I have no clue. Like really, like what that looks like.
It would take a lot of reading and a lot of rulemaking. Oh, on that kind of idea from the Martians earlier, because I recently came across this figure, I should say, in history, who was called a heretic by the Vatican at one point, who, despite having once been a priest in it. His name was Giordano Bruno. Yeah, he started, basically, at one point, he had some kind of vision that kind of changed his way of thinking about things and had him really considering the concept of infinity. If we really say God is infinite, then, there must be an infinite amount of space. Wait, does that mean there's infinite earths? Does that mean there's infinite people? Are these people all in the likeness and image of God? Do they then are they also bound to the same salvation that we are? And, this was more or less around the time for Galileo, so obviously the church has some strong feelings about this. The reason he ended up burning at the stake was because he alleged this idea that what if the Martians have God too, right? And if they don't need Jesus, then why do we? Isn't the objective truth itself more important than the symbology that's made up of earthly ideas that we have?
Which would be straying from the whole objective truth part of things, right? Like if we were doing Eucharist because it was just a cool habit, then that argument has merit.
Right.
But if Eucharist means something because Christ is Christ, that's something is always coming to that whole sequence, right, of thinking. And that if Christ is Christ, it points at validity on some level of Judaism, which points back at Scripture to be like, okay, creation, we're saying it's true because of Christ. We're not saying Christ is true because of Scripture, right? Like it's inverted, right? Like it's not because Scripture said that Christ is God that made Christ God. Right? He either is or isn't. So what I'm trying to get at is that because these practices have a functional realism in the context of relationship, to me the argument would be moot, right? Because like, I'm not taking it because it's cool, right? In the same way, for example, like I don't believe in the Trinity because it makes sense to me. It makes no sense to me. It's actually a very uncomfortable position to take, right? Like it's just like it's really rough. Like I have no idea like how to say like there's these models, right? So it's about whether something is true, as opposed to like he has hypotheticals that might be worthy of investigation, of saying if God is infinite, what does that mean? That's a great question, right? So he might have theories about what it is, right? And then, but we would be saying, okay, so long as it doesn't stray from scientific law, but I mean that in a religious sense, cool. Mm-hmm. If you've collected enough data to challenge whether our laws should be law, cool. Right? Or something got expressed more clearly because of something the Catholics call doctrinal progression, right? Like no problem. But it's again, I would be like, are you subjecting it to, as far as to objective reality that we are aware of?
I find a lot of times like these, I don't know this particular guy, I've never actually heard of him, but I find a lot of times with these, so-called mystics or something, they have like these experiences where they start writing like these dissertations on these theories. It's like you question it, like, okay, was this in accordance with your state in life when you started writing them? And that's always the biggest test, I think, for a bishop, is like it's a test of humility, right? It's like, and that's the thing, like the fathers, talk about like the first sin was curiosity, right? Because if you were led by your desire, I know it's probably not from God. It's like we have certain spiritual principles that are really useful when we kind of look at these things. And so a lot of times it's like these crazy ideas, it's like, okay, but then you start looking at the context in which they were found, the things that they were doing. It's like, okay.
It's funny to think of the Pope going, scratch that edict, low blood sugar.
Yeah, it's just, in some sense, it's like, it's an interesting question, like Martians, and what does that, like, are they, would they be considered human? Do they have like a rational soul and all these different
would
things?
Would it be wrong for me to stop being a Coptic Orthodox Christian and start being a Martian theist?
And that's when it would depend on the narrative, right? So I'm saying, I'm not asking the Martian. I'm not asking the Martian to be a human. You know what I mean? Like, or just being like, what's your story with the Creator? What does your narrative add to or elucidate in terms of your knowledge of them? If he's really who we believe factually to be, right? So like, if it became an objective fact, provable beyond any, like, to the best of our ability, that they have these experiences and they're completely different from ours, that begs a dialogue, right? Like, okay, well, what's going on here? Are we missing something? Are they missing something? Is there a misinterpretation? Like, that's that. But you're now in the realm of theology. You know what I mean? Like an actual discipline that's trying to be rooted in something real, and going at it. And so, like, I don't think the question would have to be theoretically, like hypothetically, do they need to become a Christian? Because, like, Christian theology is saying the Logos always existed. He just in time took on flesh, right? So we're not saying that there's this man who became God, and that's where the early church like fought about stuff, right? We're saying God was always God and he became man, right? So if they interacted with the Trinity and just not the incarnated Christ, that wouldn't be problematic to us, right? What would be problematic is if it was just like, no, God appeared to us and he said, I am not just Trinity, I'm also insert blah, blah, blah. Then we'd be like, okay, how do we evaluate that claim?
All right, that makes sense, though. So I have a couple more denominational questions. One, because he's here, that just popped into mind. Is purgatory real? This idea that there is a place between heaven and hell that you go to if you're not bad enough for hell, but not good enough for heaven.
Well, actually, hold on.
Okay, fine.
To make a distinction. So purgatory is not, it's not hell, right? And it's technically, all the people in purgatory are saints, right? So basically purgatory, like in the simplest exposition, is just, essentially it's a state of purification. It's like you're not, that we oftentimes we're going to pass this life and we're still going to have we're still going to have attachments we ought not have. We're still going to have, in the more juridical language, they would say like penances like not done, right? So you've been forgiven, but you still have like, I guess, penances to do. And so purgatory is kind of is a state of purification where you can actually, become, I guess, the person you were meant to be, right? Because a lot of times we'll end this life and not, we still have a lot of dysfunctions, a lot of sins, a lot of vices. And so purgatory is kind of this place to be your soul is purified, right? Now it's talked about like you're purified with the fires of hell and other things, right? Although I actually haven't studied too much. I want to. Like I know it is a dogma in the Catholic Church, but I haven't read a ton in terms of like you were talking about, like what is law and versus what is like mostly theory. And I know a lot that's talked about as though it's law is more closer to the theory part. But I don't like the Orthodox, they use a term like theosis and things like that. And it's like an ongoing problem. Like I don't think like I can't speak to exactly what the Orthodox would say on this, but like I know they have like toll houses. That's kind of one floating theory, which sounds similar to purgatory, but it's not exactly the same.
Yeah, I think the toll house thing is weird. That's like unique to one family of Orthodoxy, and even within it, not well received. I think my issue would be putting it in the realm of dogma, really, is like the main issue, right? Or just saying that they're trying to convey or communicate a purgative state, right? Like to your point, which on some levels we intersect with. Like there are some things that parallel to some extent. I think to me, my own personal issue with it is just the over legalizing of the thing, right? Or just saying, here's its structure, here's where it is, what it looks like, what the I'm like, how do you know that? Right? Like that's where it is. And it's like even again, there's like I don't get annoyed anymore. Like that used to be a point of contention a while back, but I'm like, okay, there are things that we spoke about confidently in different times of history based on our context, where I'm like, my feel on purgatory is that actually the Roman Church has distanced itself a lot from some extreme positions that were taken, like at some point. So as a basic concept of strip from it the legality of location, place, rules, governance, like of how does one go through purgatory, where I'm like, to me, that's automatically in the realm of theory, right? But the concept that there may be mercy after death is accepted in all traditions, right? So even if it doesn't carry the name of purgatory, right? There's stories in our own tradition of through the prayers of this great saint, somebody somehow made it into heaven, right? So it's just like whether he was in hell or a particular location in hell, or we don't even understand hell, right? Like regardless, like of whatever it is that we mean when we use the terminology of that, we're making a claim that something changed. That's what Rome is doing too, right? So if they, in my view, went too far at one point in history, in defining that, sure, no problem, right? Like that's I don't think that's an issue. That's something I think the more dangerous thing is to elevate something to dogma when we don't know yet, because it could be true, right? Like it's not. We're not even saying no way that that's a thing. And then being like, we don't know, so like I can't say to be this faith you must accept this part of it, right? I think that's the distinguishing there.
Yeah.
It's funny because the laity, it always sounds like, oh, we have a get out of jail free card. There's this place we can go to wimp out of hell.
Yeah, no, that's definitely not purgatory. It's like that's a common misconception, right? It's like you need to be in a state of friendship when you pass this life. Like you have to choose Christ. And purgatory is basically just, it is an act of mercy on God's part, right? It is understood as such, and it's just, I mean, I want to read more. Like I know St. Thomas talks about, I haven't gotten to that part of the Summa where he kind of goes like, okay, so like, how does the soul even change outside of the body, right? Yeah. Like how does the soul, like what alterations could be done? And then there's also the question of justice, which is like if you sinned in the body and you're trying to, make reparation for the sins that you did in the flesh, then how can you do that when you don't have your body? Yeah. So there's all this, I'm pretty sure in the Summa he goes through it, but I just haven't gotten that far.
I always liked what Alan Watts said about the topic, and the idea that if we don't have God to tell us exactly what the objective truth is all the time, we have a tendency to take the throne of the absolute. But the greater sin in that is saying where the limit of God's mercy is, in that sense. So whether there is a purgatory or whether he let some people out of hell because they had the right intentions or something, we never really know. Yeah. But we can't presume to know the limit. Thanks for tuning in for part 2 of our discussion with Father Antony-Paul, Father AP. We hope to put out part 3 very soon, so stay tuned. In the meantime, you can follow us on Twitter, YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, LinkedIn, Rumble, probably some other places soon, all of them at the Forest Creek. For inquiries or to connect with us about any of our content or services, feel free to email us at theforestcreek@gmail.com. You can find more of Father AP's stuff on his website, truthandfreedom.co. Don't forget to share, subscribe, follow, and all that. I mean, you know the deal, but listen, we're a small podcast, and we'd really appreciate your help getting out there. We'll be back soon with more. For now, good night and Godspeed.